In the spring of 1887, a geologist named Clarence Brenham Dodd descended into the Grand Canyon on a survey assignment that no one had formally authorized, and that no one, after it was completed, officially acknowledged. He was 38 years old, a contract surveyor who had worked for the United States Geological Survey for 11 years without producing anything that distinguished him from the 100 other men doing the same methodical, poorly paid work of mapping a continent that the Eastern scientific establishment had largely decided it already understood. He went into the canyon in April and came out in July. He brought out 61 pages of field notes, 12 hand-drawn stratigraphic cross-sections, and 4 physical specimens he had collected from a formation at canyon depth that he described. In the covering letter he submitted with his materials to the USG's Washington office in September of 1887, as presenting characteristics he had not encountered in any previous geological literature, and that he believed required immediate examination by the survey's senior staff. The Washington office received his submission. The covering letter was acknowledged. The notes, the cross-sections, and the specimens were never returned to him. And within 18 months, Clarence Brenham Dodd had been removed from the USG's contractor roles without explanation, had relocated from Denver to a small town in eastern Kansas, and had ceased to publish or correspond on geological subjects for the remaining 22 years of his life. I came to this through a footnote in a 1931 monograph on Cambrian stratigraphy in the Colorado Plateau, written by a USG's staff geologist named Arthur Peel, who had been working in the canyon region for 30 years, and who included, in a section on the history of geological survey work in the canyon, a single sentence noting that a contractor's survey of the Inner Gorge in 1887 had been reviewed by the Washington office and found to contain observations that were, in Peel's phrasing, inconsistent with the established stratigraphic record and therefore set aside pending further verification. Pending further verification, in a monograph published 44 years after the submission. And the further verification that Peel implied was forthcoming had, as far as I could determine, never been conducted. I spent a long time with that sentence. Then I started pulling the thread. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that what Clarence Dodd found at the floor of the Grand Canyon in the spring and summer of 1887 was not an error in his methodology, and was not inconsistent with the stratigraphic record in the way that Peel's dismissive sentence implied. It was inconsistent with the explanation the established stratigraphic record offered for why the canyon's lowest formation looks the way it does. The difference between those two things, between a finding that contradicts the record and a finding that contradicts the record's interpretation, is everything in the history of science. And it is the difference that allows an institution to set a thing aside rather than examine it, because the institution can frame setting it aside as maintaining rigor rather than avoiding a question. That framing is what happened to Dodd's notes. And the notes are still somewhere. I have traced them far enough to believe that. Consider what the Vishnu basement rocks are. Because they are the formation Dodd descended to examine, and they are what his notes describe, and you cannot understand the significance of what he wrote without understanding what the establishment geology of 1887 believed about them. The Vishnu basement rocks are the lowest exposed formation in the Grand Canyon. The dark, metamorphic foundation that the canyon's upper layers of sedimentary limestone and sandstone and shale rest upon, visible in the inner gorge where the Colorado River has cut deepest. They are old by any measure, dated in the modern understanding at approximately 7 billion years. In 1887, precise radiometric dating did not exist, but the USG's geologists working in the canyon region had developed a working chronology of the canyon's layers that placed the Vishnu materials at the base of everything, older than anything above them, the bottom of the geological record in that part of the continent. The standard understanding was that the Vishnu rocks were a metamorphic basement, ancient seafloor and volcanic material that had been subjected to heat and pressure so extreme that their original composition had been largely obliterated, leaving a dense, dark, crystalline matrix that preserved almost nothing of whatever had existed before the metamorphic event. Almost nothing. That qualifier is important, because the established understanding of 1887 and the understanding that still dominated the field in 1931 when Peale wrote his monograph, and the understanding that persists in the popular literature about the canyon today, is that the Vishnu basement rocks are geologically featureless in the sense that matters for questions of biological or structural history, that they preserve no fossils, no sedimentary structures, no evidence of pre-metamorphic conditions that would be legible to a geologist working on the surface. The heat and pressure had erased the record. This is the consensus position. And Clarence Dodd, who spent 3 months at canyon depth examining those rocks in 1887, submitted 61 pages of notes saying the consensus position was missing something. The covering letter, which I found in the USG's correspondence files at the National Archives in Reston, Virginia, in a folder labeled Contractor, Submissions 1886-1889, and which had not been indexed in the digital finding aid for that collection, meaning a researcher would have to pull the physical box and work through it by hand, describes his findings in the measured language of a man who understood he was saying something his supervisors would resist. He does not claim to have found fossils in the Vishnu rocks, which would have been immediately dismissible on well-established mineralogical grounds. He claims to have found what he describes as organized surface features on certain rock faces in the inner gorge, features that the metamorphic formation should not preserve, and that he has examined carefully enough to rule out the explanations he considers most likely: differential erosion by the river, crystal growth patterns in the metamorphic matrix, surface weathering effects. He writes that he has ruled these out not because he is certain they are wrong, but because he has found the features in locations where the river's direct erosional action cannot account for their position, where the crystal matrix of the rock does not correspond in orientation to the feature pattern, and where the weathering profile of the exposed surface is inconsistent with the age of exposure. Those surfaces should show given the canyon's known cutting history. He says he needs more expert eyes on the specimens. He says he believes what he has found is important. He says he has not been able to explain it away. I have not been able to explain it away. He wrote that in a letter to the United States Geological Survey in 1887, and it is the sentence that ended his career. This is the part I keep returning to. Not the finding itself. The finding is tantalizing, but the letter is not evidence of what the specimens showed, only evidence of what Dodd believed about them. What I keep returning to is the response. The Washington office acknowledged receipt of his submission. That acknowledgement is in the same folder as the covering letter, a form letter, signed by an administrative clerk, dated November of 1887, noting that the materials had been received and would be reviewed by the appropriate staff. And then, nothing. No review letter. No request for clarification. No second opinion solicited from an outside geologist. No record of the specimens being examined by anyone in the Washington office whose name appears in the analytical correspondence of that period. The submission went in. The form letter came out. And Dodd was off the contractor rolls by the summer of 1889. The USGS staff geologist most directly responsible for canyon stratigraphy in that period was a man named Grove Carl Gilbert, one of the most respected field geologists of the 19th century, and the person whose interpretive framework for Grand Canyon geology dominated the field for decades. Gilbert's correspondence from the period 1887 to 1890 is extensive and is held at the Smithsonian Institution archives. I read through the relevant years looking for any reference to Dodd's submission. I found one. In a letter from Gilbert to a colleague at the Peabody Museum in November of 1888, Gilbert mentions in passing that the survey has received a contractor submission from the Inner Gorge that raises questions the staff considers premature and that will be held for further development of the methodological tools required to assess it properly. Held for further development. The tools required to assess it properly. In 1888, those tools did not exist in the form Gilbert was implying would be necessary, which means held for further development was, in the scientific language of 1888, a phrase that meant indefinitely. And Gilbert's letter from 1888 is not the only evidence that the Washington response was deliberate rather than administrative. There are two additional pieces of correspondence in the USCA's director's files at the Smithsonian that bear on this directly. The first is a memorandum from an unnamed staff member. The author's name has been redacted in the copy I accessed. Whether at the time of filing or later I cannot determine. Dated October of 1887, addressed to the director's office, summarizing the Dodd submission and recommending that the specimens and notes be retained in Washington custody rather than returned to the contractor. The memorandum does not explain why return would be undesirable. It simply recommends retention. The second is a marginal notation in the director's hand on a copy of the contractor submission acknowledgement form, the same form letter Dodd received, that consists of 3 words: hold, do not correspond. 3 words in Powell's handwriting on the form that told Clarence Dodd his work had been received. Do not correspond. The direction was given at the moment of acknowledgement, which means the decision about how to handle this submission was not made after review. It was made before any review had taken place. And that is not the only document. There is a second letter, this one in a private collection, the papers of a Denver mineralogist named Samuel Trent Holloway, who died in 1924. And whose estate was partially donated to the Colorado Historical Society in 1931. Holloway knew Dodd from their overlapping years in Denver in the 1880s, and among Holloway's papers is a letter from Dodd dated February of 1889, 6 months before Dodd was removed from the USC's rolls, in which Dodd describes a meeting he has had with a representative of the Washington office. He gives no name, who came to Denver specifically to discuss his 1887 submission. He describes the meeting in terms that are controlled, but not calm. He writes that the representative confirmed the specimens and notes had been received and were in Washington's custody. He writes that the representative indicated they would remain in Washington's custody. He writes that the representative suggested Dodd's future in survey work would be better served by directing his attention to assignments the office would provide, rather than by pursuing the Inner Gorge questions independently. He writes that he has decided not to pursue them independently. He writes that he does not entirely believe this is the right decision, but that he has a family, and that the survey is the only employer in the field who can provide consistent work. He had a family, and the survey was the only employer. That sentence has stayed with me since I read it, because it describes exactly how an institution silences a question without ever having to name the question as a threat. It does not say your findings are wrong. It does not say the specimens will be destroyed. It says your income depends on your cooperation, and it leaves the rest to the person who has to feed their children. Dodd understood what had happened. The letter makes that clear. He did not pretend otherwise to Holloway. He wrote it down honestly, in a private letter to a friend, and then he moved to Kansas and became, in the geological record, a name in a footnote in a monograph published 44 years after the thing that made him worth footnoting. Consider what the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon was in 1887 in terms of access and institutional control. The canyon had been surveyed by John Wesley Powell's expeditions of 1869 and 1871, the famous river descents that produced the first systematic maps of the canyon's structure. Powell had gone on to become the second director of the USGS, a position he held from 1881 to 1894, and his interpretive authority over the canyon's geology was therefore not merely scientific, but administrative. The canyon was, in the late 1880s, Powell's domain in the most literal institutional sense. A contractor who returned from the inner gorge with findings that challenged the interpretive framework Powell's own work had established was not simply a scientist raising a question. He was a contractor challenging the director's scientific legacy on the director's own ground, and doing so at a moment when the USGS was fighting for its budget and its institutional credibility with a Congress that did not always see the value of funding geological abstractions. The institutional context of 1887 is the only way to understand why the response to Dodd's submission was a form letter and an eventual dismissal rather than a field team and a follow-up survey. This story is not singular. Between 1880 and 1920, the USGS and the Bureau of American Ethnology, the two primary federal scientific agencies with field presence in the Canyon region, received a total of at least 9 contractor and independent submissions describing findings in the canyon's lower formations that were inconsistent with the established interpretive framework of that period. I have found records of 7 of these in various archives. Of the 7, 6 received the same administrative response Dodds received: acknowledged, held, not returned. Not published. Contractor not retained. One was published in a minor journal in 1902 with editorial notes so extensively qualifying the author's conclusions that the paper had no discernible impact on the field. The pattern is not proof of a coordinated suppression. It is proof of an institutional culture that had a very clear mechanism for handling findings that didn't fit. A mechanism that required no deliberate decision, only the routine operation of a bureaucracy that had more incoming material than it had capacity to assess, and that therefore assessed, in practice, the things that confirmed what it already knew. The notes. 61 pages of field observations from the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, made by a geologist who spent 3 months at canyon depth in 1887, are somewhere in the federal record system. I say this with more confidence than I can fully justify in the space of what I know. But I can tell you what grounds the confidence. The USG's accession records from the 1887-1895 period, which I have worked through in Reston, show that contractor submissions were not routinely destroyed. They were filed, often in ways that made them difficult to locate. But the institutional culture of the survey in that period was to retain physical material. The specimens Dodd submitted were almost certainly incorporated into the survey's reference collection, where they would have received catalog numbers, and where they may still be. The notes would have been filed with the correspondence, and the correspondence from that period, while not fully digitized, is largely intact. I have found the covering letter, the form letter of acknowledgement, the Gilbert reference, the Holloway correspondence. The thread exists. I have not followed it to the end. What was lost when Clarence Dodd moved to eastern Kansas and stopped writing about geology is not only the 61 pages. It is the tradition of independent field observation in the canyon's lower formations that his work represented, and that his dismissal effectively ended for a generation. The inner gorge in the period after 1889 was surveyed, when it was surveyed at all, by USG's staff geologists working within the interpretive framework their institution had established. The question Dodd had raised, whether the Vishnu basement rocks contained surface features that the metamorphic consensus could not account for, was not raised again in any document I have found in the federal or institutional archive. Not because the answer was found, because the question was removed along with the man who asked it. He died in 1909 in Larned, Kansas, There is a brief death notice in the local paper. It describes him as a former government surveyor. It does not mention the canyon. It does not mention the 3 months at depth. It does not mention the 61 pages that are still somewhere in the federal record system, filed in a box that no finding aid accurately describes, waiting for someone with enough time and enough specific knowledge of the 1887-1895 USG's contractor filing system to locate them. I think they are locatable. I think someone who knows those records and has the access to pull the right boxes would find them. I have not found them yet. But the covering letter is there. The acknowledgement is there. The Gilbert reference is there. The Holloway letter is there. The thread is intact. The notes are at the end of it. If you know someone who has stood at the South Rim and looked down into that inner gorge and felt the weight of what those dark rocks at the bottom are, how old they are, how much they have survived, how little of their history we can actually read, share this with them. Clarence Dodd spent 3 months reading them in 1887 and came back saying he had found something he could not explain away. The institution that received his findings decided not to try. That decision is still in effect. The notes are still wherever they were filed, and the inner gorge has not changed.